In this video, we'll take a look at how to obtain data from a text file. In the lesson text for Lesson 16, I made a case for why it's still important to understand the fundamental input and output operations when it comes to text files. In a nutshell, it's simply because in the IT world today, even though there's better ways to transfer data around, the text file still seems to be one of the preferred methods to move data between departments or between companies, because many of those companies are using systems that are too costly to change to take advantage of new technologies like web services and XML. So in this lesson, what I'm going to do is show you how to open up a text file, and I've already created a sample text file called test.txt, and you can see that I have two rows of data here. It's very simple. A user ID in the left-hand column, 1 and 2. Then the next column is the name, and then the final column is an occupation, or at least a skill set, Visual Basic Programmer or C++ programmer. And so what I want to do is create a simple application that will just open up this text file and grab out each of the lines of the text file and then do something simple like just display them in a message box. Then in the second pass, what I'll do is take each one of these lines and actually split them up into an array, because as you can see, the values are separated by commas. So we'll take a cue from Lesson 16's readings, and hopefully you read the text in Lesson 16, and we're going to use the split function to return each line into an array and store each of those arrays into a different type of array called an array list. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to do, or that I've already done as you can see here, is that I've created a new project called Lesson 16, and what I want to do is drop a button onto the form and then double click that button to get into the code view. I'm not going to name it or make it look good at this point. I just want to do this very quickly so I can get into the code view and start writing some code. The very first thing that I'll want to do is go up to the top and import or use a namespace that I know I'll need in order to work with files, and that is the system.io namespace. And by the way, I/O stands for input and output. It lets us, it has classes in this namespace that allow us to open up and modify files, write to files, change directories, get listings of files or directories, and a lot of file-based operations. So let's go ahead down to our button one click event and start typing in some code. The first thing I'm going to do is create a stream reader object, sr equals new stream reader, and then I'm going to do some fancy typing here, something you may have not seen yet. And let me explain what this line of code does. In fact, I'm just going to paste some comments above this line of code so we can kind of talk through them. The first thing that I want you to notice is the use of this stream reader object. This is actually part of the system.io namespace, and as I've got here in this comment area, the stream reader object allows you to read lines of information from a standard text file. And so we'll use this to open up the text file and then read line by line from that text file. So in the constructor of the stream reader object, I can create or send in the path to a file that I want to work with. Now, you'll notice here that I use this @ symbol, and this is the symbol that's used to indicate that I want to use a verbatim string literal. Why the need for a verbatim string literal? Why couldn't I just have done this? Well, the problem is that whenever you see the backslash in a string in C#, C# is going to think that you're trying to use an escape character. It just so happens that this particular escape character of \t represents a horizontal tab, and so it would invariably look at this, try to open up C:\tab est.txt, and obviously this would not work. It would not open up the file that we need. Now I can escape the backslash by putting two backslashes in a row, and that would give me essentially the escape character for the backslash, so it would interpret it correctly. Or I can just go before the string and type in my little verbatim string literal character. Any way that you want to do it is fine. You'll notice that I've got this all detailed here in the comments, so you'll definitely want to look at the source code that I'm using here for this lesson. Okay, so I'm back in my button 1 click event, and let's scroll down and type in some more code. The first thing I want to do is create a string variable called line, and this is what we'll use to hold the line of text that's retrieved from the text file. And then I'm going to create another variable called finished. It's of type Boolean or bool, and we'll initialize its value to false. Now I'm going to use that in a while statement to check and make sure that we're not at the end of the file. So we're going to read a line and then check and see if there's any more in the file. If there is, we'll read the next line, and if that's the last line, then we'll kick out of our while statement. So here's what I'm going to type: while not finished. And let me explain this syntax that I've used here, and I've pasted in some more comments to help us look at this exclamation mark finished. What does that mean? Well, essentially the exclamation character equates to the word not. So basically, since finished is a Boolean value, it can only be true or false. And by default, if we're just going to check this would mean while finished equal true. It's just a shorthand way of doing this. Or I can do while finished is not true by using the exclamation mark equal sign. Now, if I want to check to make sure, that this is false, I could just do that. But there's a shorthand method of doing this, and that's just using the exclamation mark before the Boolean. So while finished, or rather while we're not finished, while finished equals false, then let's read a line from our stream reader. Okay, so what I've done here is I've pulled off a line from the text file. By reading the line, I've essentially moved the counter in the stream reader to the next line. So I don't have to do this, something like this, next line. That's automatically implied whenever we read a line from our stream reader. But what I do want to make sure is that I don't have an empty line. So I'm going to do this. If we do encounter a null line, then what I want to do is set my Boolean finished variable to true. We're done. We've reached the end. Otherwise, I want to show the content of that given line. So that's all I'm going to do for this first example. We've looked at just a few important concepts here, like the purpose of the stream reader, how to get this this verbatim string literal, and how to actually loop through a file and check to make sure that we haven't hit the end of the line. And when we do, we can kick out of our while statement, of our loop that looks through the file. Let's run the application just to make sure that this works, that we don't have any syntactical errors. And it looks like this was the first line of our text file, and that was the second line of our text file. And it looks like we've exited gracefully, so it looks like we're successful on this first pass. Now before we move on, I just want to highlight one thing that I've done in code that you should never, ever, ever do, and that is that I have hard-coded the path to a file as I pass it into the constructor of the stream reader object. Please read my instructions in the text in Lesson 16 on why it's a very bad idea in a production environment for a real application that you're going to create to hard-code strings like I'm doing right now. The reason I did it is for simplicity's sake. It's just an example, and I hope you understand that I'm doing it just so we can focus on the actual opening of the file instead of talking about best practices that we've already discussed a few lessons ago. But you should ideally never hard code paths to files or any other system resource in your code, because what if that doesn't exist or is named something slightly different? Then your application won't function correctly, and you'll have users that are fairly upset with you as a result of that. So do as I say, not as I do, at least in this particular instance. Okay, so let's take a second pass at this application, and this time what we'll do, instead of just popping up each line to a message box, what we want to do is take each one of those values, each one of those fields that were separated by commas, and put them into an array and make it more useful for processing purposes. Then what we'll also do is then run through that array of values from the text file and put them into a new text file. So let's go ahead and go back here and add another button to start off with. And I think what I'm going to do to start is just copy this code, because some of the things that we've already done will stay the same, but we'll want to add some new functionality as well. And I'll go ahead and get rid of the comments here, just so we can make this a little more compact. So the first thing that I want to do is I need to change this line of code, because instead of just displaying things in a message box, what I would prefer to do is add items to an array. But this isn't a simple array that I need. I actually need either a two-dimensional array or an array that can hold other arrays. And while I could use a two-dimensional array, the problem with that is that I would have to know ahead of time how many elements that I would expect to have in my text file. And there's really no way for me to know that in a real-world scenario. I might have 10 rows one day and 50 rows the next day, depending on how I'm structuring my application and what that text file actually contains. So I'm going to use a more flexible type of an array, and it's a collection called an array list. So the first thing that I'm going to want to do is dimension a new object called an array list. We're going to call this contents. And array lists are very easy to work with. They're flexible, and I find myself using them quite a bit in the applications that I write. Now, the other thing that I'm going to need is to have a way to separate each of the individual values within a given row of data. So, for example, let's take a look at our file again. I want to put this in one element of an array, this in another element of an array, and this in yet a third element of that array. You can see that these values are separated by commas, so I'd like to split these three values out. Now, I could use some complex looping where I would look to see if I could find a comma and then take everything before the comma and put it off into one element of an array and look at each and every character of the next phrase, which is my name, and then find the comma and then split that off all into another element of the array, and so on. However, there's an easier way to do this, and that is through the use of a split function. Actually, the split method is a method of the string class. So I'm going to need a place to put those values. So I'm going to create an array called line values. So each line will be put into this array. We'll split up each line into three values, three elements, and then that whole array will be added to the contents. And so we would expect to have 2 items in contents and 3 items in each of the 2 arrays. This will make a little more sense once we get further into it. So for right now, let's just start coding. First line of code is going to be line values equals line dot split, and then we're going to type in the comma character. Okay, just 2 or 3 things that I want you to notice. First of all, we've already talked a little bit about the split method, and what I've done here is just pasted in a little comment that gives you more information about the split method. And essentially what I've done is passed in the comma character. Now, why didn't I do this instead? Because the double quotes indicate that we want to pass in a string literal, but what this split method needs is a character literal, just one character. So that's why we use the single quotes instead. Okay? Now the next line of code will be okay. So let's just recap what we've done here. We've taken a single line that's returned from the stream reader of the file, and we're going to split that row into 3 elements of an array based on the comma character. And then we're going to take that array and pass it to the add method of our array list. So now our ultimate goal is to print this back into another file, but just to make sure that we've done this correctly up to this point, let's loop through our array list that contains arrays, and let's print the value. Let's concatenate all the values of the array back together, but use a different separator like a dash, and then display them in a message box, just to make sure that we're doing this right. So alright, so there we go. What have I just done? Well, basically we're going to work backwards and go through each of the elements of our array list and pull out an array. So the first element, or the first item in our array list, will return the first array of values that we pulled from the text file. Now actually this is not going to work, because what this will do is return an object, but it doesn't know that we're trying to fit that object into an array, a string array. So what we need to do is cast the whatever's returned by contents sub counter and cast that to a string array. So here's what I'll do. By putting in a type in parentheses before another value, in this case an array list that returns the first item or the second item of that array list, we are changing the data type, not permanently, just temporarily, so that we can fit it into a variable that holds a different type. Now we've talked a little bit about type conversion, but we haven't talked about casting. And they're fairly analogous, but the difference is that casting is a temporary thing, just meant to be used in order to evaluate something on a temporary basis, while conversion permanently changes one type into another type. Then I'll take my line values array and start grabbing off each element of that array, concatenating them together inside of a message box in order to display it to the user. So let's go ahead and run this and see if it works. Okay, you'll notice now that I display 1 dash Bob Tabor dash Visual Basic Programmer, 2 dash Dan Starr dash C++ Programmer. Okay, so essentially this is our way of making changes to the data, splitting it out, and then concatenating it back together. So we'll want to do something very similar to this as we try to write these values into a different text file. So to do this, what we'll want to do, first of all, is create a StreamWriter object. And again, in the constructor, we're going to send in the path of the file that we want to write to. And this is very close to what we did for the stream reader. And now, what I'll want to do whoops. So to do this, the first thing we'll want to do is create a StreamWriter object. And we'll write to a file called test2.txt. And now I want to loop through all of the items in my array list, which will give me back array elements, just like we've done here, except this time I'll want to write those into a text file. So we're going to need to grab out the line values just like we did in this loop. So I'm just going to copy that. In fact, I'll just copy this since it's pretty much what I need. And instead of showing it in a message box, what I'm going to do is sw.writeLine and that should work. So just to show you that there's nothing on my sleeve, I'm going to show you the contents of my local hard drive. Currently I have just test.txt. I'm going to run this application, and with any luck it'll actually work the first time we try. So we get our message boxes and then nothing else. So I'm going to assume that it all worked correctly. Now ideally you'd want some type of feedback to the user, but this is just a sample application. So now let's open up our Windows Explorer again and take a look, and indeed there is test2.txt. However, there's nothing in it, so we've done something wrong. What we've done wrong is that while we've told our application to write to this file, the write line basically puts it in, I guess, what you would call a cache to be written once the file operation has has ended. However, we're still running the application and pretty much shut it down without closing the file. So you have to close the file first before you can expect it to flush out the cache and actually write values to the file. And we'll also close the stream reader as well to free up that resource. Let's try this again. I'm going to open up my Windows Explorer, go to my C drive again. I'm going to delete test2.txt, minimize this, and then let's run the application again. Get our message boxes, and this time let's open up our Windows Explorer, test2.txt, and you can see that the values are correctly written in. So we were successful in what we set out to do. We actually covered a lot of ground in just a few short minutes that we've been talking about text files. We talked about how to open them and read from them, how to iterate through them and grab each line, then split up each line into an array and then save that array into a collection of arrays, a type of array called an array list. And then we also talked about how to iterate through that array list, grab out each one of the individual arrays, and write the values from that array back into a separate file using a different format, which, by the way, is something that you're probably going to have to do sometime in the future if you have a career in IT, and that is to reformat the data. Take it from one source, change it somehow, and then save it back out to another file or to another place. Then finally we learned how to close our readers and the stream writer as well. So in this video I follow pretty closely to what the lesson text for lesson 16 discussed. You'll find a more thorough discussion in the lesson there, as well as some additional readings that will help you understand text files and arrays just a little bit better. And obviously you'll want to do the exercise at the end of that lesson so you can get your hands dirty and internalize some of the things that we've just been talking about. Thank you.